Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I'm here to do a little rebacking tutorial, and I'm going to show you how I go about the process of adding contact paper to the back of my decks. So in this video, I'll show you how I reback a standard deck without trimming it first. And then I'm going to show you how I trim and reback all in one step with this card. And then I will show you this new technique that I've been working on, which is recovering with scrapbooking paper. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, so to show you how to go about this, I'm going to show you two different methods. One is if you just want to cover a card, cover the back of it, you're not looking to trim it or anything. You just want to recover the back because you want to reinforce it or because it's just plain ugly. So we'll do that first, and then I will show you how I actually do a card back when I'm going to trim it. So I do two different processes. You can, of course, trim an entire deck first and then reback it, but I like to save a step when I can. So we'll talk about that more here in a minute. So once I have it cut down to a square, I'm just going to peel the contact paper off. So just to recover this, basically what we're going to do, how I do this, is I lay it down over the top. And because you need to look out for air bubbles, I kind of just squish it through here and rub it down and move it across. Now this is why I have it on this plastic. You need to have it on something that you can peel it off of, that it's not going to permanently stick to, like raw wood. So once you get that down, make sure that you don't have any air bubbles. I like to kind of just flip it over and push it in there good. Now you can just use scissors. You can use scissors and just, trim all the way around this. But I find that the scissors, whether I'm using the little ones or my big ones, once I get going and I get like to the middle of the card, I find it hard to get it right up against the edge of the card. So I like to keep my scissors just for the corner, and I use my craft knife to trim away the excess. So you just set it up there right against the card, and you just trim off the excess. Be very careful if you're using a craft knife that you don't accidentally slip into the card. I have several cards that I have rebacked that have the slightest little, they have nicks in them, and some of them have like slight cuts. Maybe I'll do it on purpose on this one so you can see what I'm talking about. It's very easy to accidentally get into the card like this. I don't know if you can see what I just did, but it's very easy to accidentally do that with a craft knife, especially if you have a card that's thin. It seems easier on the thinner cards to accidentally go into the card. So maybe I can show you here. Hopefully you can see that I have sliced into that card there. I do have a couple of decks that I've rebacked that some of the cards do have a few little slices in them, but it doesn't go through the card. It just kind of scratches the top of it. Definitely not preferable, but it's not world shaking for me. And then once I get this excess trimmed off, I use my scissors to trim it. Now you could also use a corner rounder, but I do just want to mention that if you use a corner rounder to trim with contact paper, you are going to get some of this gunky sticky stuff in your corner rounder. If you do that, if you decide to use a corner rounder on your contact paper, I suggest you have a corner rounder dedicated just to that, so that when you go to trim your decks, when you go to just trim a normal deck, you're not getting that sticky residue on another deck. So now at this point, I just take my little scissors and I just round my corners. And pull that extra off. And it's always fun to play, get the little sticky corners off your fingers. That's a fun game that I've played quite a bit. So now we have our rebacked card. So the next one that we're going to do is if you want to reback and trim a deck. Now I only recommend this if you're working with a thinner cardstock. This does not work well with a thick cardstock like these big thick shiffer ones. These ones have to be, if you have a thick cardstock and you're going to reback it and trim it, they do need to be done separately. So you need to first trim them and then reback them, because if you try to trim through all of this, through a thick cardstock plus the contact paper, you're going to end up eating up your corners, because it's going to be really hard for your trimmer to get through it, not to mention your corner rounder. So if you have a really thick cardstock, make sure that you do them one step at a time. If you have a thinner cardstock, like your typical US Games, you know, Llewellyn, just your typical cardstock, you can trim it and reback it all at once. So that was the process that I used for my Worth. So this deck was actually rebacked and then trimmed and corner rounded all in one go. It saves you a step, but again, it only works with a thinner cardstock, because once you get that contact paper on there, that's a lot for it to get through. So for this process, the first thing we're going to do is actually cover our card in contact paper before we trim it. So we're going to peel it off and we're going to follow the same process. We're going to pull this down. Now the great thing is, as you can see, I got air bubbles in there already. Some contact paper, it's easier to get the air bubbles out than others. So just by smushing it down like this, you can work all of those air bubbles out. And then we peel it back up. There are lots of different ways that you can do this. You know, you can just lay the contact paper over the top of it as you're holding it here and then work your way through. I've just found that the laying it down and pressing it out seems to work the best for me. Now that we've got our card covered in contact paper, I am going to go ahead and just trim it down a little bit, because if I try to get this into my trimmer, it's going to stick. So if I were to stick this, I'll just show you. If you try to stick this in here with all this contact paper on it, you might get some sticky on there. It might stick. It depends on how sticky your contact paper is. You can always try it, and if it doesn't stick, then you're good to go. It is important to note that if you leave all of this extra contact paper on here, you are going to get sticky on your blade. So that's another reason why I just real quickly, I mean, you could take scissors and just, you know, run it along the edge here and, you know, do this little number. Since we're going to be trimming it, it doesn't have to be perfect. You're just getting the excess off so that we don't gunk up our trimmer. If you're going to be rebacking a bunch of decks, I recommend getting a trimmer and a corner rounder that you keep specifically just for that, because anytime you're working with sticky things, you have a tendency to get residue. Now, obviously, if you're trimming a deck that you're rebacking, you're going to have to use the front as your guide. So hopefully that was what you were intending. Otherwise, if you're wanting to use the back as your guide, you're going to need to trim it first and then reback it. But most of the time we use the front as our guide, so we just reback it and then we're going to take it and trim it like normal. So we trim off that excess and then we take our corner rounder and we just punch our corners. Now this is a little bit harder for the corner rounder to get through. Again, if you had a really thick deck, this wouldn't work because you wouldn't be able to actually punch through it. It would be too thick. But with this particular cardstock, this thinner contact paper, we have, you know, I'm able to get through all of that. So there you go. So that's trimming and rebacking all in one step. Okay, I also want to show you real quick a new technique that I've been playing with, which is rebacking with scrapbook paper and then adding contact paper over the top of it. Now, I've been looking at doing this process, which was actually inspired by my meditation cards, and I have a couple different videos on these. These are my oracle deck that I'm making, so to speak. And it kind of inspired me to take a look at maybe using that same technique to reback a deck. So real quick, I'm just going to show you how I do this. It's not a terribly fancy process. You just need your card and you need some scrapbook paper. Now, of course, if you're going to be doing the whole deck in one pattern, you'll need however many sheets of that you need. A page of scrapbook paper is generally 12 by 12, so you just need to figure out, measure your cards, figure out how many cards you can fit on a piece of scrapbook paper, and then purchase that many sheets in the pattern that you are looking for. Now, if you're going to do them in different sheets or in different backs, you could buy a book of scrapbook paper, which generally has a similar theme or a similar pattern, or at least a cohesive color scheme. And you could do the backs all using that whole pad in different backings, which would be really pretty too, I think. So those are just some quick notes on rebacking with the scrapbook paper. So all we're gonna do here first is, my Fabri-Tac is not behaving these days, is go ahead and glue on the back of the card. We want to make sure we get down to those corners pretty well. I'm going to squish it down so I'm not getting, like, look at my Fabri-Tac. It's not behaving. Anyway, so then we just lay our paper down. Now, obviously, if it has a certain pattern, you want to make sure you get it in the right, if you're trying to match your patterns up exactly on your cards, you would definitely want to make sure that you line that up properly. Okay, so we're gonna let this dry for a few minutes, and then we're gonna come back and cut the paper off and then cover it in our contact paper. Okay, I've come back to check on it and it is dry, but the other thing I want to note is that you can see that my corners are not glued down very well. And I didn't get the edges very well. So what I'm gonna do is go back and add a little bit more Fabri-Tac, a little bit more glue to those sections, because I want the paper to be glued down. If my glue would stop misbehaving. Just to let you know, this is one of the frustrations of Fabri-Tac, is that sometimes the glue starts, I'm not sure why, it starts getting really, really thick, and then it starts just oozing out of the bottle like this, and it just makes a mess. And if you're doing like just squishing it on the back of a card, then it's okay. You can just kind of work that glob out. But in trying to do like little detail work like this, you can see I'm going to go ahead and do it, but I'm going to get that oozing out like everywhere. So we're just going to sit that and let it ooze. So now that I've done this and I've made this mess, let me show you how I fix that. Just paper towel, and we're just going to dab away from the card because we don't want to rub this glue on the front of our card. Now the great thing about the Fabri-Tac, other than what it's doing right now, is that if you do get it on the front of your card, generally, once it dries, you can generally rub it off. Hopefully, if you are using Fabri-Tac, yours is not misbehaving like this, because mine is being naughty today. Okay, let's just cover that up. If you put the lid back on it, it helps stop it from doing that. Okay, so now that we've done that little adventure, let's let this dry for a minute, and we'll be back once that's dry to trim it down and put the contact paper on it. Okay, now that we have let this dry, we're gonna go ahead and trim it down and then cover it with our contact paper. And rebacking is really, it's a labor of love. It's an artistic, process. It's a great bonding experience, but it is definitely a time-consuming process. So now you can see we've got our card rebacked in our beautiful scrapbook paper, but this would not hold up really well to a lot of use. It is just plain paper, so it wouldn't be the best in terms of holding up to shuffling. So to help with that, we're going to cover it with clear contact paper, and it's basically the same process. I have a lot of extra contact paper here, so I'm going to trim it down just so I don't have quite so much to work with. The less overflow you have on the contact paper, I have found, the better. So get rid of this extra here. And then we basically just follow the same process as we do with regular contact paper. You can see that this is clear. This one does have kind of a film to it, so it's not, or a texture, so it's not completely crystal clear, but it is clear enough that you can definitely see the image through it. Now, it's really important to note that if you follow this process like I do before, and you peel this up off the paper, this is not going to peel up. As you can see, I am pulling pretty good, and it's not coming off. So, real important to note the difference that on a card back, you can re-peel this contact paper and reposition it. When you're working with the scrapbook paper, you need to be extra careful, and you need to not get pieces of scrapbook in your contact paper, which I just did. So yeah, you need to be extra careful and not get stuff in it like I just did, but I don't want to cut a new piece, so we're going to roll with it. But anyway, you need to be really careful about how you lay it down because it does not peel back up off the paper very easily. And I have had it actually, when I've tried to peel it back up, it's just ripped the paper. So that's, you have to be a lot more careful with this process, because you cannot reposition it, you cannot peel it back up, and if you get anything underneath there like I just did, it's going to be in there. Once it's on there, it's on there, and it's on there more so than if I were adhering it to the you know, sort of glossy or semi-glossy back of a card. You can peel this back off of the card backs. It does not come back up off the scrapbook paper very well at all. So just make sure that you're putting it down very carefully and you're not getting anything in there like I just did, because now that's stuck in there. So now we're just basically going to repeat the same process as before. We're going to trim away the excess. You can use your scissors or you can use a craft knife, as I am doing here. And contact paper gets everywhere when you do this. So embrace the sticky, because that's what's going to happen. And round our corners. Now again, I could use a corner rounder for this, but I do not like to use my corner rounder just for trimming off these sticky things, because all these little sticky corners are going to get stuck in your corner rounder. And I have done it before, and it is a pain to get out. Okay, so now we've got our card rebacked with scrapbook paper and covered in clear contact paper to make a new back. And this, I think, is really beautiful. It takes a bit more time and effort, but I think like the wood grain is fine and it looks beautiful on a lot of decks, but this is just gives you just so much more freedom, and it's so pretty. And you get just a lot more option than you do, like, you know, this is pretty standard what you can find in contact paper these days. You know, you have your wood grains, you have your kind of metallics, your leathery, and your kind of marbly stone looking backgrounds. But using the scrapbook paper just allows you to open it up to any pattern you want, any pattern you could find. Okay, let's talk real quick about some of the mistakes that I have made. So one of the biggest mistakes that I made, the first deck that I rebacked, was my Wildwood Tarot. And I bought a really pretty expensive contact paper on Amazon. And it ended up being super thick, much thicker than these kind of standard contact papers that you find. I bought this fancy stuff. It looked really beautiful online. I'm not sure if the camera will pick it up, but in person it looks really cheesy. The printing is really blurry and it looks really bad. And I also discovered that once I put the contact paper on and it sat for a few days, the contact paper shrank. Now, I didn't know that this was a thing, and I went online and I researched, and apparently with certain types of contact paper, certain brands, this is a thing. It happens on regardless of what you put it on. So this particular paper shrank, and now I have green edges to all my cards on my Wildwood. So I decided to try and pull it off because I wanted to reback it in this new contact paper that I had bought. That this is the contact paper that I kind of see everybody reback this deck in. And I went to try and peel this off, and it pulled the entire greenback off the card and ruined it. So now I had to get a second deck, a second copy of this. This copy maybe I'll use for some crafting or something, but I do have a second copy that I got in a trade that I'm going to be rebacking instead. This contact paper also, for some reason, the edges make it stick together really badly. And I don't know if it's because it's shrank or what the deal is there, but you can see like some of them I can't even they're just sticking together. This contact paper is just a hot mess. So this is one of the reasons why I always test my contact paper now, and I put it on a sample card and I've let it sit for a few days if it's a contact paper I've never used before, because I don't want a repeat of this. So some contact paper does shrink. Make sure that if you're ordering contact paper online, or even if you're purchasing it in the store, look up the reviews and see if anybody has mentioned whether or not the contact paper shrinks, because that can be really disappointing when you spend all this time rebacking, 78 cards, and then a couple days later you realize that it shrank and now you can see the edges of all your cards. So that was one of the first mistakes that I made. The second mistake that I made in rebacking a deck is I put this is my, Wisdom of the Oracle deck. Again, you can see I got shrinkage here because you can really see it on this deck, I think. I put the contact paper on and a few days later it shrank down. And had the exact same issue I had with my Wildwood. These are also sticking together really, really badly. And if you can see, if I pull out my my Worth, I don't have any of that. I have no shrinkage. I have no sticky. They shuffle beautifully still. So this is why I say it's super important to practice first. Know what you're working with. Understand your materials. The other thing I did with this deck is I wanted this marbling on the back because I thought, oh, how pretty that would be, right? So this marble contact paper is really, really thin. So once I put it on, you could see the red backing really pretty clearly through the contact paper. So I thought, well, what a bummer. I still want to use this contact paper because I really like the marbly look and I think it looks really pretty with the front, which would have been the case had I not got the shrinking, but so I put a second layer on. So this deck has 2 layers of contact paper on it. It is now gigantic. It is super thick. It is super heavy. It is super sticky, and it's just the contact paper shrank, and it's just a mess. Yeah, kind of ruined it when I rebacked it. And these cards now, this thing is like, oh. It's super thick because it's a thick cardstock anyway, and it's got 2 layers of contact paper on it. And you can see the lovely red that I was trying to cover up when the contact paper shrank. So that was my second mistake that I made with my contact paper. The third mistake that I made with my contact paper was to purchase contact paper that was not permanent. And it's removable. It's repositionable, I think is what they call it, which is fabulous unless you want to stick it to a deck and you want it to be permanent. So this particular black, I purchased it. It was repositionable. So basically, as soon as I put it down on the card, it would peel right back up. So whenever I use this black leather contact paper, I have to glue down the corners, which I mentioned earlier. So I had to do this with both my Nicoletta and my Marielle. I did trim them, I rebacked them, and I glued down all the corners. So these decks are definitely labors of love. So important to note that you're getting the right kind of contact paper. And also important to note that when you go to edge a deck that has contact paper on it, a couple of different things. One is that if you have to use the glue to stick down the corners, it's really hard to get your ink, your stamp, marker, whatever it is you're using, it's really hard to get it to adhere to the glue, any glue that seeps over. So you need to be careful when you're gluing on there. I had to use permanent black Sharpie to cover up the glue on the corners of these, which was not my intention for this deck, but I ended up making it work. Sometimes when you do the markers with the contact paper, it can take a lot longer for the marker to dry because it's trying to adhere to this glue residue. So some of the markers, such as the Crayola, I have found take a lot longer to dry when you're putting them on a deck that's been edged in contact paper, so you might want to keep that in mind. Permanent marker seems to do a little bit better, seems to dry faster and cover well, but it also bleeds, and you know how I feel about that if you watch my channel. So just a couple things to note. The stamp pads, like the distressed inks, I do have a tendency to have to go over multiple times. This was done with distressed ink, and I had to do multiple layers to get the distressed ink to cover up and stick to that, to stick to the sides with the contact paper, because even though you're cutting it, it's still a little bit sticky. There's still a little bit of residue. You can't really feel it, but it is there, and the stamp of the marker will pick it up. So just to kind of recap, some of the most important lessons are some contact paper does shrink. So make sure that you practice first and give it a few days if you can. Let it see how it adheres to the card, see if it shrinks. It's not easy to tell on this one, but this is that contact paper, and I can see in comparison to the others, I am getting some shrinkage even on this one. It's not showing up quite as badly as it is on this particular deck. The cardstock does matter. Some cardstocks it shrinks more on than others, but so far it's shrunk on everything I've put it on. If you have a super, super glossy deck, like the Mary L here, like the Schiffer decks, you may have to use glue to get the contact paper to adhere to the really, really heavy lamination, the really super, super glossy. Like I said, this was repositionable that I accidentally got. So I had to glue it down, but I have had other instances where the contact paper, even the permanent contact paper, wouldn't really stick and adhere to super glossy cardstock. So the other thing is make sure that your tools are sharp. So contact paper is a little bit harder to get through, to cut through, because it's sticky, so it has more resistance than just trying to cut paper or even trying to just trim cardstock. That sticky gives it some resistance, so make sure that your tools are good and sharp, and that will help you get a cleaner cut. Contact paper does add thickness and height to your deck, so a deck that might be pretty thin and slim to begin with will bulk up quite a bit when you add contact paper to it. And if it's a super thick cardstock anyway, you're gonna get these big old chunky monkeys like my Mary L, because this is a thick cardstock, and then I rebacked it and added a whole nother layer to it, so it bulked up quite a bit. Shuffling, for the most part, will become more problematic once you reback a deck with contact paper. I have found that most of my decks I can still, for the most part, shuffle. This particular one, I cannot bridge it back together, but I can riffle shuffle it, and I can overhand shuffle it, although it does stick a little bit with the overhand, but it does still work. Some decks with some contact paper, like this, there's no way. This is just, it sticks so bad that it's, you're not going to get a mix in there and then trying to get it back together. Yeah. But then other ones will be, will shuffle just as well as they did before you covered them. So it does make the deck super durable, and it's really, you can shuffle this all day. It's really fabulous for really thin cardstock. It adds a lot of stability and strength to the cards. It makes them very flexible. It makes them very pliable, and it makes them a lot sturdier, so you can really kind of, beat them up. So I hope you enjoyed this deck mod tutorial, and I hope that you found it informative and entertaining, and that you will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.